I'm Linda Hudson Scanlon. I'm class of 1956, and I was the managing editor of the Cornell Sun when I was here. And I've been asked to do an introduction, very brief introduction of our speakers tonight. And I want to start off by telling you a little bit about what I think is going to be the subject of tonight's talk, or much of it. And that is media or news literacy. To give you a little bit of background, about the time most of you in this room, at least the students who are here, were born, the government was releasing a computer network system for commercial use. This network was barely out of its infancy at that point. And I can recall about this time, some 20 years ago, meeting with a group of journalism educators, because I was then teaching journalism at a university. And we were discussing what this new electronic network might mean to us and what we were teaching and how we taught it. It was by then known as the internet. And one of my colleagues in this discussion, who was more prescient than most of us, said the internet is going to be journalism without editors. And I thought at the time, as a reporter, I'd had a couple of editors ruin a few stories, and I thought, well, maybe this isn't going to be such a bad thing. But I also, if I were honest, I would have to say that I probably had more stories salvaged than savaged by these editors. But now, 20 years later, journalism educators are still wondering, how do we teach communication in a world where information, both true and false, reaches it, every corner of it, instantaneously? I think what we hear tonight might be part of the answer to that. News readers and viewers, listeners and surfers, internet surfers, need to take over more of the editorial function themselves. They have to be skeptical of what they hear and read and see. They need to spot holes, information holes in stories, and learn how to fill them. And most of all, they need to put information in context and perspective for themselves and for their families and their country. Now, on to the panelists for the evening. Vivian Schiller is currently the Senior Vice President and Digital Officer for NBC News. She was formerly CEO of National Public Radio and held executive positions at the New York Times, Discover, and CNN. She was founding chair of the News Literacy Project, which sends working journalists into schools to help teach kids critical thinking skills. And she's a Cornell graduate, the class of '83, but not a Sun alumni.
Sadly.
Okay. Also, Dean Miller, who is also the class of '83 and was a Sun staffer, has worked for 24 years as a newspaper reporter and editor in the Northern Rockies. He instructed me to say the Northern Rockies because he said if I said Idaho, which is where he actually worked, people would think it was Iowa. So, he is now with the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University outside of New York City, and recently he returned from training news literacy teachers in, of all places, Bhutan. He defines news literacy as the application of critical thinking skills to the citizen's search for reliable information in the news media. And finally, but certainly not least, our panel will include Stu Laurie, who was the Sun editor-in-chief in 1954. He worked for 28 years in newspapers before joining CNN as, among other things, vice president and Moscow bureau chief. His book, 7 Days That Shook the World, chronicled the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and most recently, in fact last year, held a distinguished Fulbright professorship at the Center for East European and American Studies at the University of Poland in Warsaw. We have commenting on the presentations tonight, Nicholas van der Wal, who's the Maxwell Upson Professor of Government and Chairman of the Department of Government here at Cornell, and Frederick Logeval, Director of the Mary Einaudi Center for International Studies and the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies. He is with the History Department. So we have a very distinguished group, and I hope that you all will enjoy what they have to say and learn from it, and also be ready to question them.
You know, the Michelle Obama eye roll, at this point, it's accepted fact that she was rolling her eyes at something John Boehner said. And yet, if you go look, it's a GIF for starters. So who knows how much it's been doctored. And second of all, she could be saying to somebody across the table, you know, do you want iced tea? No thanks. It's a little flash of the eyes. I mean, much has been made of this thing with absolutely no reporting or verification that she was somehow dissing John Boehner. So the election brought us a lot of things that were a little bit disturbing. I mean, we heard sort of through the back door the New York Times finally admit that they have been regularly, routinely giving quote approval to sources in Washington, D.C., which is to say, write the story based on the interviews, but before publication, as a quid pro quo for getting the interview, the source requires approval of all quotes. I would have fired reporters for that 15 years ago. It's pretty remarkable how far the standards have slipped, and we see this kind of thing coming up pretty often.
I think this is one of the most exciting times in journalism in the history of communication. To be sure, there are bad actors out there. To be sure, you must be, I completely agree, always a skeptical consumer of news. But I think that the information that is available to us today and the power that is in the hands of all of us as news consumers, or as I forgot who it was, used the expression, the people formerly known as the audience, because none of us are the audience anymore. We're all in it together, have never been so empowered. In fact, if you see a problem with a news organization, whether it's the place, NBC or any place else, yes, you can call, you can write that newspaper, but you don't even need to do that. You can just go on Twitter. I think Twitter has revolutionized the way people communicate. And if you are not actively following many people on Twitter, you should, including myself, at Vivian Schiller, and I will participate, and I'll follow you if you let me know who you are, because you have a voice. And in fact, so many of these stories that have, plagued our industry and are heartbreaking, whether it's Jason Blair or Janet Cook, I think in many times a lot of those, this is a different era. I think a lot of those stories would have never gotten as far as they did today, because there are so many people watching, and in every community there are so many people there, and such an easy way to say, wait a minute, you talk about somebody in my town, in my school, I don't know that person. I also think that there are far more, well, I have worked for some of the, I feel very fortunate, some of the great legacy news organizations who have been around for decades. I happen to be with NBC now, but before that I was with NPR, before that with New York Times, and before that with CNN. The wonderful thing is you have so many other news sources available to you now that are online only. I'm not saying, please, I am not saying stop watching NBC or going to NBCnews.com or MSNBC.com or Today.com and any of our many other fine sites like thegrio.com and NBCLatino.com. There's my plug. But you've got many new players who are online only, who specialize, with excellent journalists who specialize in their verticals, whether it's TheVerge.com for technology, whether it's Quartz.com for business.
It seems to me that the 47% and what it suggests about what Romney as president might do about dismantling social programs. Huge difference between the parties, no? And the problem is precisely that journalists didn't want to talk about that difference because it's not as interesting in some ways. So better to think of it as a gaffe, and what will he do about it?
It's clear that a more news literate public in the U.S. would greatly improve the sort of civic mindedness of voters, and would inform our political process. And as a sort of as a normative project, I think, yes, this is great. As a sort of practical matter, though, I think the prospects are very, very poor, because, and in a sense, when you talk to college students, you're talking to a relatively small elite and people who are already pretty good consumers of the news. For most people, I don't think they feel that the news engages them, and maybe it's in that sense that the trivialization of the news is actually a way for people who otherwise don't much care about the news to focus on the news, and to maybe then there's an entree into substantive issues about policy debates, which I don't want to suggest are trivial.
Can I just say also, I think there's no such thing, to my mind, as bad content, unless it's wrong or unfair or libelous or those kind of things. I mean, the fact that people write stories, BuzzFeed, does their slideshows of, Sasha Obama's 15 facial expressions yesterday. Fine, there's nothing bad about that. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as, but on the other hand, a lot of news organizations, including mine, we do some kind of fun stuff. We also put out more substance stuff, but the onus is on us to make it interesting. I mean, the audience is the boss. We can't say, we're going to give you content that we think is important, and if you don't want to read it, we don't care. So fine, let there be the slideshow of Sasha Obama's expressions, and we'll give you other stuff too that you find interesting. And it's a diet. You can have a media diet that includes all of those things.